Most people spend their lives trying to become impossible to ignore by doing more. They speak more, message more, explain more, give more, and remain constantly available, believing that their endless presence will make them unforgettable. They think that if they always show up first, always make the effort, and always prove their loyalty, people will naturally value them. But human psychology tells a completely different story. What is always available slowly becomes expected, and what becomes expected often loses its emotional impact. This is why many people who give the most are often appreciated the least. Their constant presence no longer feels special because it has become predictable. If you truly want to become the absence they can't ignore, you must first understand one powerful truth. People rarely notice what is always there. They notice what is missing after it is gone. The greatest mistake most people make is believing that attention creates value. In reality, value creates attention. When your entire life revolves around making sure someone notices you, your behavior begins communicating emotional dependence instead of confidence. You reply instantly because you fear being forgotten. You keep conversations alive because silence makes you uncomfortable. You constantly check whether someone has responded because your emotional state depends on their attention. Every action quietly says the same thing. My peace depends on you. But the moment another person becomes responsible for your emotional peace, your absence loses its power because your presence has already become expected. The people whose absence cannot be ignored are never emotionally dependent on being noticed. They carry a quiet confidence that allows them to step back without fear because their identity is not built on constant attention. Think about the people who leave a lasting impression on you. It is rarely because they demanded your attention every day. More often, it is because they brought genuine value whenever they were present. Their conversations had depth. Their actions carried purpose. Their energy felt calm rather than desperate. And when they were no longer around, you naturally noticed the difference. That is the psychology behind becoming an unforgettable absence. Your absence only has weight when your presence consistently added something meaningful. If your presence is built on chasing, pleasing, and seeking validation, your absence often creates relief instead of curiosity. But when your presence is built on character, confidence, wisdom, and emotional stability, your absence leaves a space that cannot easily be replaced. One of the strongest psychological reasons people become forgettable is overavailability. Many people believe availability is proof of love, loyalty, or kindness, but unlimited availability often destroys perceived value. The human mind quickly adapts to anything it receives without effort. When someone knows you will always answer immediately, always forgive every mistake, always rearrange your priorities for them, and always remain there regardless of how they treat you, they slowly stop recognizing the privilege of your presence. This does not always happen because they are selfish. It happens because familiarity reduces appreciation when there are no healthy boundaries. Becoming the absence they can't ignore begins with understanding that your time, energy, and attention are valuable resources, not unlimited gifts to be given without purpose. This does not mean disappearing to manipulate people or pretending not to care. There is a major difference between emotional games and emotional independence. Manipulation tries to create artificial distance so others become anxious. Confidence creates healthy distance because your life is full of purpose beyond chasing anyone's attention. A person who is deeply committed to personal growth, meaningful work, strong values, and inner peace naturally becomes less available, not because they want to be missed, but because they are genuinely building a life worth living. Ironically, this authentic focus often creates the very absence that people cannot ignore. When your attention is no longer constantly seeking others, others naturally begin wondering where your attention has gone. Notice how insecurity behaves. It constantly tries to maintain visibility. It fears silence because silence feels like rejection. It sends another message after being ignored. It explains unnecessarily. It keeps proving its worth long after respect has disappeared. Every one of these actions weakens the emotional impact of your presence because they communicate one hidden belief. I am afraid of being forgotten. But dangerous self-respect replaces that fear with certainty. It understands that people who truly value you will notice your absence without being reminded of your existence every day. Real connection does not need constant maintenance through desperation. It grows stronger through mutual respect and genuine appreciation. There is another psychological truth that most people overlook. Your absence becomes powerful only after you stop abandoning yourself. Many individuals become so focused on earning attention that they neglect their own goals, health, discipline, and personal growth. Their entire schedule begins revolving around someone else's availability. They slowly lose the qualities that once made them interesting because every decision is centered on keeping another person close. But the moment you redirect that energy toward becoming wiser, stronger, healthier, and more disciplined, everything changes. Your life develops momentum independent of anyone else's approval. Now your absence carries weight because your presence is no longer ordinary. It belongs to someone with direction, purpose, and self-respect. The irony is that the less obsessed you become with being remembered, the more unforgettable you become. When you stop chasing attention, you begin creating genuine value. When you stop forcing conversations, your words gain meaning. When you stop making yourself endlessly available, your time becomes significant. When you stop seeking validation, your confidence becomes visible. These changes are subtle, but they transform the way people experience you. They no longer see someone asking to be noticed. They see someone whose presence enriches the room and whose absence quietly changes it. That is the first step toward becoming the absence they can't ignore. You do not achieve it by disappearing from people's lives. You achieve it by becoming so emotionally independent, purposeful, and valuable that your presence becomes meaningful. And when that meaningful presence is no longer there, people naturally feel what is missing. And once your presence is built on genuine value instead of constant availability, you'll understand why scarcity is one of the most powerful psychological forces that makes your absence impossible to ignore. Once your presence is built on genuine value instead of constant availability, something remarkable begins to happen. People start noticing your absence in ways they never did before. This is not because you disappeared to create drama or to manipulate emotions. It is because human psychology places greater value on what is limited than on what is always within reach. Scarcity has always influenced the way people think, feel, and behave. Whether it is time, opportunities, relationships, or attention, the mind naturally becomes more aware of things that are no longer constantly available. That is why becoming the absence they can't ignore is not about learning how to disappear. It is about becoming someone whose time, energy, and presence are too valuable to be given away without purpose. Most people make themselves emotionally available to everyone at every moment. They answer every message immediately, accept every invitation, tolerate every form of disrespect, and remain present even when their presence is no longer appreciated. They believe this makes them reliable, but over time it often makes them predictable. And predictability, when combined with unlimited availability, slowly reduces perceived value. The human mind adapts very quickly to consistency. When people become certain that you will always be there no matter how they treat you, they unconsciously stop recognizing the privilege of your presence. This is why your absence never creates an emotional impact. There is nothing to lose because they never believed they could lose access to you in the first place. Think about the people who leave a lasting impression. They are rarely those who spend every moment proving themselves. Instead, they have full lives. They are committed to meaningful work, personal growth, discipline, family, purpose, or a mission greater than temporary approval. Because their lives are driven by purpose rather than attention, they naturally become selective with where they invest their energy. They are fully present when they choose to be, but they are never constantly available simply to avoid being forgotten. This balance creates something incredibly powerful. Their presence feels intentional, and because it is intentional, their absence is naturally felt. People remember them because every interaction carries substance instead of desperation. One of the greatest misunderstandings about scarcity is believing it means becoming distant for the sake of appearing mysterious. That approach usually becomes manipulation, and manipulation never creates lasting respect. Real scarcity is different. It is the result of priorities. When your life is filled with meaningful goals, disciplined habits, deep learning, physical health, emotional growth, and purposeful work, you simply do not have unlimited time to chase every person who enters your life. Your attention becomes valuable because it is directed with intention. People begin respecting your presence because they understand it is not available to everyone equally. That is the kind of absence they cannot ignore. Not one created through games, but one created through purpose. Human behavior repeatedly demonstrates this principle. Imagine two individuals. The first rearranges their schedule every time someone calls. They abandon their own priorities whenever another person demands attention. They constantly check whether people need them because being needed has become their identity. The second person values relationships just as deeply, but they also protect their goals, routines, and peace of mind. They respond thoughtfully instead of instantly. They make time intentionally instead of automatically. Their life continues moving forward whether people praise them or ignore them. Which person creates a stronger emotional impact when they are no longer around? The answer is obvious. The second person becomes the absence people notice because their life never revolved around chasing attention. Another reason scarcity creates value is that it forces people to experience your absence instead of taking your presence for granted. As long as someone receives unlimited access to your time, they rarely stop to consider what your life contributes. But when your attention becomes less available because you are genuinely focused elsewhere, they begin noticing what your presence once added. Maybe it was your calmness, your wisdom, your encouragement, your reliability, or your positive energy. Whatever made you valuable becomes visible only after it is no longer constantly there. This is one of the deepest psychological truths behind the title. Your absence cannot be ignored when your presence consistently offered something meaningful rather than simply existing out of habit. Many people fear becoming less available because they believe they will be forgotten. Ironically, the opposite often happens. People rarely remember those who constantly compete for attention. They remember those whose lives clearly had direction beyond seeking approval. A person who is endlessly chasing everyone appears emotionally dependent. A person who is deeply invested in building themselves appears emotionally secure. That quiet confidence creates curiosity because it communicates abundance rather than need. Others begin asking themselves where your attention has gone, not because you tried to make them wonder, but because your life has become too meaningful to revolve around them. There is also an important lesson about boundaries. Every time you say yes when you truly mean no, you make your presence easier to overlook. Every time you sacrifice your own priorities to avoid disappointing someone, you quietly teach them that your time has no limits. But every healthy boundary sends a different message. It communicates that your attention has value. It shows that your life is built on purpose rather than people-pleasing. Boundaries do not push good people away. They help good people understand the worth of your presence. And when your presence is respected, your absence naturally carries emotional weight. Eventually, something changes inside you. You stop measuring your importance by how often people contact you. You stop worrying about whether someone noticed your silence. You stop creating artificial opportunities to stay in people's minds. Instead, you focus on becoming someone whose character, discipline, and purpose naturally leave a lasting impression. That transformation is the real source of scarcity. It is not about withdrawing to be remembered. It is about becoming so deeply invested in your own growth that your presence becomes meaningful and your absence becomes impossible to ignore without you ever asking for attention. And once your absence begins carrying real emotional weight, the next step is learning how emotional discipline, not emotional reactions, is what makes that absence truly unforgettable. Many people believe that becoming unforgettable means being louder, more expressive, or constantly reminding others of their importance. They think they must always react, always respond, and always make their presence known. But the people whose absence is truly impossible to ignore follow a completely different path. They understand that emotional control creates far more influence than emotional intensity. The less your emotions are controlled by other people, the more valuable your presence becomes. And when your presence is built on emotional stability instead of emotional dependence, your absence naturally leaves a lasting impact. This is why becoming the absence they can't ignore begins with becoming emotionally unavailable to manipulation, emotionally unavailable to life. One of the greatest reasons people lose their value in the eyes of others is because they react to everything. Every delayed message creates anxiety. Every disagreement becomes an argument. Every criticism demands a defense. Every small change in someone's behavior immediately changes their mood. Without realizing it, they allow other people's actions to control their emotional state. The problem is not that they have emotions. The problem is that their emotions become predictable. Once people know exactly how to trigger you, upset you, or pull your attention back toward them, they quietly gain influence over your behavior. A person whose emotions are easily controlled rarely becomes an absence anyone deeply values, because their attention is always available to whoever knows which emotional button to press. Think about how manipulation often works. It rarely begins with force. It begins with emotion. Someone ignores you to see if you will chase them. Someone criticizes you to see if you will become defensive. Someone withdraws attention to see whether you will abandon your own peace just to regain theirs. These situations reveal something important. They are not only testing your patience, they are revealing whether your emotional balance depends on their behavior. If every action they take immediately changes your emotions, they never have to value your absence because they know your attention can always be recovered with the smallest emotional trigger. But when you remain emotionally centered, something changes. Your calmness communicates strength, and your absence begins carrying weight because it is no longer controlled by someone else's actions. This does not mean becoming cold, distant, or refusing to care about people. There is a profound difference between emotional independence and emotional indifference. Emotional indifference disconnects from everyone. Emotional independence simply refuses to let someone else's behavior determine your self-worth. You can love deeply, care sincerely, and remain kind while still protecting your emotional peace. In fact, people whose absence cannot be ignored are often those who care with maturity rather than desperation. They listen carefully, they are fully present, and they give genuine attention, but they never lose themselves trying to hold on to people who continually disrespect their value. Human psychology naturally respects emotional stability because it creates a sense of certainty. Imagine two individuals facing the same situation. One becomes anxious the moment they feel ignored. They send repeated messages, demand explanations, and allow fear to dominate their actions. The other notices the distance, but continues living according to their values. They protect their routines, remain committed to their goals, and refuse to let temporary uncertainty destroy their peace. Which person's absence carries greater emotional impact? The answer is obvious. The second person becomes unforgettable because their presence was never driven by emotional need. Their attention was always a conscious choice rather than a desperate requirement. Another reason emotional discipline makes your absence impossible to ignore is that it creates mystery without trying to appear mysterious. Many people attempt to create curiosity by pretending not to care. They deliberately delay responses, play emotional games, or act distant to force others to chase them. These strategies usually fail because they are rooted in insecurity rather than confidence. Genuine emotional discipline requires no performance. You are not silent to manipulate someone. You are silent because every situation does not require your reaction. You do not withdraw attention to punish anyone. You simply refuse to invest energy where respect no longer exists. This authenticity makes your absence far more powerful because it reflects inner confidence rather than calculated behavior. Consider how often people destroy the emotional impact of their own presence by overreacting. They explain every misunderstanding, defend themselves against every opinion, and chase closure from people who have already decided not to understand them. Instead of allowing silence to preserve their dignity, they surrender their emotional balance in the hope of changing another person's mind. But people whose absence cannot be ignored understand a deeper truth. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Not every criticism deserves an answer. Not every departure deserves pursuit. Sometimes the strongest statement you can make is continuing to move forward without allowing someone else's choices to interrupt your peace. That quiet strength remains in people's minds far longer than endless emotional reactions ever could. As you become emotionally stronger, something remarkable begins to happen. You stop asking yourself, why aren't they noticing me? Instead, you begin asking, am I protecting the value of my own presence? This shift changes everything. Your conversations become more intentional. Your attention becomes more meaningful. Your time becomes more selective. You no longer give emotional access to everyone simply because they ask for it. You reserve your energy for people who appreciate it, respect it, and reciprocate it. As a result, your presence becomes memorable because it is no longer ordinary. And when that meaningful presence is absent, people naturally recognize what they have lost. The greatest irony is that the less emotionally controlled you become by others, the more emotionally significant your absence becomes. You stop chasing people who pull away. You stop reacting to every emotional test. You stop abandoning your own peace to maintain someone else's comfort. Instead, you become grounded in purpose, self-respect, and emotional stability. That is the kind of person people remember long after they leave the room. Not because they demanded attention, but because their calm presence added something that could not easily be replaced. When your emotions can no longer be manipulated, your absence begins speaking with a power that words never could. And that is exactly why the strongest people focus on building a meaningful life rather than an audience that constantly watches them. Most people believe that becoming unforgettable requires more visibility. They think they need to post more, speak more, prove more, and constantly remind the world that they exist. They chase recognition because they fear disappearing from people's minds. But the people whose absence can never be ignored follow a completely different philosophy. They do not build their lives around being seen. They build their lives around becoming valuable. And that difference changes everything. A person who lives for attention becomes forgotten the moment attention moves elsewhere. But a person who lives with purpose leaves an impression that remains long after they are gone. If you truly want to become the absence they can't ignore, stop trying to build an audience that watches you and start building a life that naturally commands respect. One of the greatest psychological traps is making your entire identity depend on being noticed. Many people wake up every day asking themselves one silent question: who is paying attention to me? They measure their worth through messages, compliments, invitations, recognition, and approval. When people notice them, they feel valuable. When attention disappears, so does their confidence. This is one of the most dangerous forms of emotional dependence because it places your identity in someone else's hands. The more you need an audience to feel important, the less powerful your presence becomes. Why? Because people can sense when someone is performing for validation instead of living with purpose. Your presence becomes an attempt to impress rather than an opportunity to contribute. And a presence built on validation rarely creates an absence that anyone deeply remembers. Now compare that to someone whose life revolves around growth instead of applause. They wake up focused on improving their mind, strengthening their body, mastering their craft, protecting their peace, and building a future that excites them. They are not ignoring people. They are simply no longer distracted by the need to constantly be seen. Their attention is invested in becoming better rather than becoming popular. Because of this, every conversation they have carries substance. Every interaction reflects confidence instead of neediness. Their presence feels genuine because it is not searching for approval. And when they leave, people naturally feel that something meaningful has disappeared. This is exactly how you become the absence they can't ignore. Your absence gains power only after your life gains purpose. Human psychology always respects people who clearly have direction. Think about those individuals who leave a lasting impression wherever they go. They are not necessarily the loudest people in the room. Often they speak less than everyone else. They do not compete for attention, because their confidence comes from what they are building, not from who is watching. They value their time because they know exactly where it is going. They are busy becoming someone they can respect, even if nobody applauds the process. That quiet dedication makes their presence rare, and rarity creates value. When they are no longer around, people notice because they brought focus, discipline, wisdom, or calmness into every room they entered. Their absence cannot be ignored because their presence was never ordinary. One of the biggest reasons people become forgettable is that they sacrifice their purpose to maintain attention. They abandon personal goals to stay available for everyone else. They postpone their dreams because they fear disappointing people. They spend hours scrolling through other people's lives instead of improving their own. Slowly, they stop growing. They become emotionally occupied with who noticed them rather than who they are becoming. The tragedy is that while they desperately try to stay in everyone's thoughts, they slowly lose the qualities that made them interesting in the first place. A meaningful life cannot be built while constantly seeking an audience. It is built through discipline, patience, and consistent personal growth. And those qualities naturally make your absence unforgettable. Another powerful psychological truth is that purpose creates emotional independence. When your life is filled with meaningful goals, you no longer panic every time someone becomes distant. You do not immediately abandon your priorities because one person stopped replying. You do not interrupt your own growth to chase temporary attention. Instead, your mission keeps moving forward. This is incredibly attractive because it communicates stability. People begin understanding that your life has value beyond any single relationship, conversation, or opinion. That realization changes how they see you. Your presence becomes intentional rather than available by default. And because your presence has become intentional, your absence begins carrying emotional weight. Notice how different your energy becomes when you stop needing to be noticed. You become a better listener because you are no longer trying to impress everyone. You become calmer because your peace no longer depends on constant recognition. You become more confident because your self-worth comes from progress rather than praise. Every improvement quietly increases the value of your presence. You no longer enter a room wondering whether people will remember you. Instead, you enter with genuine substance, and substance always leaves a stronger impression than performance. This is why becoming the absence they can't ignore has very little to do with disappearing and everything to do with becoming someone whose presence genuinely matters. There is another lesson hidden beneath this idea. Purpose protects you from emotional desperation. People who have no direction often cling to anyone who gives them attention because attention becomes their only source of significance. But people who are building meaningful lives never need to chase connection out of fear. They appreciate relationships, but they do not depend on them for identity. They can love deeply without losing themselves. They can care sincerely without abandoning their mission. Because of this balance, they never appear emotionally empty. Their life already has meaning before anyone enters it. That inner fulfillment is exactly what makes their absence impossible to ignore. When they step away, people notice because they were bringing genuine value, not simply asking to receive it. Eventually, you reach a point where you stop asking, how do I stay in their mind? And begin asking, how do I become a person whose presence improves every place I enter? That single question transforms everything. You stop investing your energy in appearances and begin investing it in character. You stop chasing applause and begin chasing excellence. You stop trying to be visible and begin trying to be valuable. Ironically, that is the moment people begin remembering you the most. Not because you demanded attention, but because your disciplined, purposeful life created a presence that could never be replaced by someone who simply wanted to be seen. And once your life is built on purpose instead of performance, you will discover that sometimes the most powerful message your absence can leave behind is spoken through silence rather than words. Words have a strange power, but silence often has an even greater one. Most people believe that every misunderstanding must be corrected, every accusation must be answered, and every opinion must be challenged. They spend countless hours explaining themselves, defending their intentions, chasing closure, and trying to convince people to see them differently. They believe that if they can just find the right words, they can control how others perceive them. But the truth is that endless explanations often reduce your value instead of protecting it. The people whose absence can't be ignored understand a deeper psychological principle. They know that silence is not weakness. It is confidence expressed without permission. When your silence is supported by self-respect, it begins speaking louder than any argument ever could. That is why becoming the absence they can't ignore requires learning when to stop talking and allow your absence to deliver the message your words never could. One of the biggest reasons people become forgettable is that they explain themselves too much. Every decision is followed by a justification. Every boundary is followed by an apology. Every misunderstanding becomes a long conversation. Without realizing it, they teach others that their choices require approval. The more you explain every action, the more you communicate that you are uncomfortable standing behind your own decisions. But people whose absence leaves a lasting impression behave differently. They understand that not everyone deserves access to their reasoning. They make decisions based on their values, not on the fear of disappointing people. When they choose to leave an unhealthy relationship, step away from disrespect, or protect their peace, they do not spend weeks trying to convince everyone that they made the right choice. Their quiet confidence gives their absence weight because it is supported by certainty rather than insecurity. Human psychology is naturally drawn toward what it cannot completely control or predict. This does not mean becoming mysterious for the sake of appearing interesting. It means refusing to surrender your peace simply because someone expects an explanation. Many people panic when others misunderstand them. They immediately rush to defend themselves because they fear losing someone's approval. But the harder they chase understanding, the less valuable their words become. Ironically, when you constantly try to control people's opinions, you give those opinions control over you. Becoming the absence they can't ignore begins with accepting that some people will misunderstand you, no matter how perfectly you explain yourself. Once you stop fighting every misunderstanding, your silence begins communicating something powerful. It shows that your identity no longer depends on universal approval. Think about how emotional arguments usually unfold. One person criticizes, the other immediately becomes defensive. Then another explanation follows, another accusation appears, and the conversation slowly turns into an endless cycle where neither person truly listens. At the end, nothing has changed except emotional exhaustion. But imagine responding differently. Imagine protecting your peace instead of protecting your ego. Imagine recognizing that some conversations are not seeking truth, they are simply seeking your emotional reaction. When you refuse to provide that reaction, something remarkable happens. Your calmness remains, your dignity stays intact, and your absence from unnecessary conflict becomes far more memorable than any speech you could have delivered. This is exactly why silence often creates a stronger emotional impact than endless words. There is another reason silence makes your absence unforgettable. It protects your mystery without pretending to be mysterious. People who constantly reveal every thought, every feeling, and every future plan leave little room for curiosity. Everything about them becomes predictable because nothing remains private. But emotionally mature people understand that not every achievement must be announced, not every struggle must be shared, and not every opinion must be expressed. They allow their actions to reveal who they are over time. Their quiet consistency becomes more convincing than dramatic declarations because they speak with intention rather than impulse. Every word carries greater significance. And when they are no longer present, people remember the depth they brought rather than the noise they created. Silence also becomes powerful when someone tries to pull you back into unhealthy patterns. There will always be people who expect unlimited access to your time, your emotions, and your attention. The moment you establish boundaries, they may question your character, accuse you of changing, or attempt to make you feel guilty for protecting your peace. This is where many people lose the power of their absence. Instead of quietly standing behind their decision, they return to explaining, apologizing, and seeking permission to choose themselves. But every unnecessary explanation weakens the message your boundary was already communicating. A healthy boundary speaks clearly on its own. Your absence becomes impossible to ignore when people realize that your silence is not anger. It is self-respect. This does not mean silence should replace honest communication. Healthy relationships require openness, honesty, and mutual understanding. Silence should never become a tool for punishment or emotional manipulation. The difference is intention. You communicate with people who genuinely seek understanding. You stop explaining yourself to those who are committed to misunderstanding you. That distinction protects your energy and preserves the value of your presence. It reminds you that your time should be invested where respect already exists, not endlessly spent trying to create respect where it has never been offered. As you become comfortable with silence, something changes inside you. You stop feeling responsible for everyone's opinions. You stop chasing the last word in every disagreement. You stop believing that your value depends on convincing people who have already decided not to understand you. Instead, your actions begin carrying the message your words once tried desperately to deliver. Your presence becomes calmer because it is no longer searching for validation. Your absence becomes stronger because it leaves behind quiet certainty instead of emotional chaos. People begin remembering you not because you argued the longest, but because you respected yourself enough to walk away without abandoning your dignity. The greatest irony is that those who constantly fight to be understood are often overlooked, while those who quietly live according to their principles become unforgettable. Their silence is never empty. It is filled with confidence, discipline, and self-respect. And because they refuse to waste their energy proving their worth, their absence begins creating a question in the minds of others that words could never force. What made this person so different? That question is what gives your absence lasting psychological power. And once your silence begins carrying more influence than your explanations, you are ready to become the kind of person whose very absence changes the room long after you have walked away. At the end of every meaningful connection, people remember one thing more than your words: how your presence changed the space around them. They may forget the exact conversations, the details of certain moments, or even the reasons you entered their lives, but they remember the emotional impact you created. They remember whether you brought calm or chaos, strength or insecurity, purpose or distraction. This is the final truth behind becoming the absence they can't ignore. Your absence becomes powerful only when your presence carried genuine value. You cannot disappear and expect people to feel your loss if your presence never gave them anything meaningful to remember. The goal is not to become difficult to reach. The goal is to become difficult to replace. Most people misunderstand what it means to be valuable. They believe value comes from being admired, popular, attractive, successful, or constantly surrounded by attention. But attention is temporary. Popularity changes. External approval can disappear without warning. Real value is deeper. It is found in character, emotional stability, reliability, wisdom, discipline, and the ability to make people feel respected without losing yourself in the process. A person who brings these qualities into every environment creates an impact that cannot be copied easily. When they are present, people feel the difference. When they are absent, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. This is not because they demanded importance. It is because their actions quietly proved it. Think about the difference between someone who enters a room seeking attention and someone who enters carrying value. The first person watches everyone carefully, searching for recognition. They change their behavior to be accepted. They speak only to impress, agree only to belong, and remain visible because they fear being forgotten. Their presence depends on the room giving them something. The second person enters without needing the room to confirm their worth. They listen with attention, speak with purpose, and contribute without begging for approval. Their presence gives more than it demands. Because they are not emotionally dependent on being noticed, they create a feeling of stability. And when that stability is no longer there, people recognize what has disappeared. This is why becoming the absence they can't ignore is never about playing games. It is not about suddenly disappearing, so people become anxious. It is not about withholding affection to force someone to chase you. It is not about creating jealousy, confusion, or emotional pain. Those strategies may create temporary reactions, but reactions are not the same as respect. Someone can miss access to you without valuing you. Someone can chase attention without appreciating your character. Real influence is different. It is built through consistent value. You become unforgettable when people realize that your presence improved their lives, challenged them to grow, brought honesty into confusion, or created peace where there was chaos. Your absence then becomes meaningful because something genuine is no longer there. The strongest people understand that value must be protected. If you give your best energy to people who repeatedly disrespect it, your presence loses its meaning. If you constantly sacrifice your principles to remain accepted, people may keep you close, but they will not necessarily respect you. This is why boundaries are essential. A boundary is not a wall built to punish others. It is a standard that protects what you bring into the world. When you respect your own time, people learn that your time has value. When you protect your peace, people understand that access to your emotions is not unlimited. When you refuse to remain where you are repeatedly diminished, your absence becomes a consequence of self-respect rather than a strategy for attention. There is also a powerful lesson about consistency. One impressive moment does not make someone unforgettable. Value is created through repeated behavior. It is built when your words match your actions, when you remain dependable without becoming available to everyone, and when you show strength without becoming arrogant. People begin trusting your presence because they know what it represents. They know you will bring honesty without cruelty, confidence without superiority, and support without dependence. Over time, this consistency becomes part of the emotional atmosphere around you. Then, when you are no longer present, the room feels different, not because you demanded to be missed, but because the qualities you carried are no longer there. Your absence also becomes powerful when you stop fearing it. Many people remain in places where they are undervalued because they are afraid no one will notice if they leave. They stay in one-sided relationships because they fear being replaced. They continue giving to people who never reciprocate because they believe leaving means losing. But the person who understands their value no longer measures strength by who tries to keep them. They know that walking away from disrespect is not becoming invisible. It is refusing to make yourself smaller just to remain included. They trust that the right people will recognize their value, while the wrong people may only understand it after the absence has already begun. As you grow, your definition of being remembered changes. You no longer ask, how can I make them miss me? Because that question still places your identity inside someone else's mind. Instead, you ask, what kind of presence am I becoming? You focus on becoming more disciplined, more emotionally mature, more capable, more honest, and more purposeful. You develop a life that does not depend on being constantly noticed. And because you are no longer trying to force your way into people's thoughts, your impact becomes natural. You become memorable through substance, not performance. You become valuable through character, not attention. And your absence becomes impossible to ignore because your presence was never ordinary. This is the final transformation. You stop chasing people to prove that you matter. You stop making yourself endlessly available to avoid being forgotten. You stop explaining your worth to those determined not to see it. You stop using silence as a game and begin using it as a form of self-respect. You build a meaningful life, protect your energy, and become emotionally independent. Then something powerful happens. Your absence no longer needs to announce itself. It speaks through the calm you once brought, the strength you quietly demonstrated, the wisdom you shared, and the standard you refused to abandon. Becomes so valuable that your presence improves the room, and when you leave, let your absence reveal what your words never had to prove.